Okay, so x, and then you put it into this equation, you get k equals 1, and then you put the 4 there, and then I think you do x of I, and then you put the 6 there. I don't get it. Am I ever going to get any smarter?
You will.
Okay.
The answer's 2.
Hi, how'd you get in? And second of all, am I going to have to call the cops?
No. Relax. The answer's 2. You're going to get smarter.
What
You're gonna
have
get into,
I been drinking?
You're going to get into a great university.
Are you real?
I'm you from the future.
Oh. I have a more important question. Am I going to get better at making videos?
Of course, and it's great that you asked that because today, later, you'll find out we're making Unit 11, Intelligence.
Let's get started.
Let's talk about intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems, learn from experience, and use our knowledge to adapt to new situations. Now, we're going to go through a list of psychologists and discuss their theories on intelligence. Charles Spearman believed we have one general intelligence, or G, at the center of all our intelligent behavior. You can see an animation of G here. Another psychologist, L.L. Thurstone, identified 7 clusters of primary mental abilities, such as inductive reasoning or spatial ability. He gave out a bunch of tests and found out that those who scored well on the tests in one of the 7 clusters tended to score well on the other clusters. So his findings basically supported Spearman's theory of general intelligence, or the existence of the G. And modern research confirms that the general intelligence factor G indeed exists. Psychologist Howard Gardner has proposed 8 relatively independent intelligences and views each intelligence as a group of abilities that come in different packages. An extreme version of one of these packages is savant syndrome. Sometimes I think that Will has savant syndrome.
Ready to go?
Bro, while you were getting ready, I just got 6 different girls' phone numbers and I memorized them all.
How'd you memorize them so quickly?
I don't know. I just did. I'm gonna text them right now and tell them to hang out at my place tonight.
But you just met them.
Yeah? We're just gonna bake cookies, nothing more. They'll assume that.
I don't think you understand what you're implying.
What do you mean?
Psychologist Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory proposes 3 intelligences. Analytical intelligence is used to solve well-defined problems with a single correct answer. Creative intelligence is the ability to come up with new ideas and adapt to new situations. And finally, practical intelligence is used for everyday tasks that have multiple solutions. So our advice to you on how to be successful. Success isn't only based on intelligence. It's also based on grit, which is passion and perseverance when pursuing long-term goals. So if you fail at something the first time, keep trying. Finally, let's discuss emotional intelligence. It involves 4 abilities. The first is perceiving emotions in other people and in yourself. Second, understanding emotions and being able to predict them. Third, managing emotions, so you know how to express them in different situations. Fourth and finally, using emotions to help with creative thinking.
For as long as we've tried to understand intelligence theoretically, we've tried to measure it practically through intelligence tests, or tests which try to score your mental aptitude. These tests differ slightly from achievement tests, like the ones you take in your AP Psych class. Achievement tests assess how much you have learned in the past, but aptitude tests try to predict future performance by assessing how quickly you learn.
The SAT is a perfect example of an aptitude test, but even getting an extremely high score doesn't guarantee that you'll turn out okay.
Anyways, we'll now go through some important leaders in the field of intelligence testing.
First up is Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin and believer that intelligence traits were passed down through genes. Galton's intelligence test included measuring reaction times and muscle strength, so it didn't do a great job of seeing if people were smart, but he's remembered as the first person to try to measure intelligence.
Sounds like a really cool guy, but what about this dude, Alfred?
Well, he's a Frenchman. He was a Frenchman, tasked by the schools of Paris to create a test to see which children needed extra attention. To do this, he and his friend Theodore Simon pioneered the concept of mental age, which is a measure of intelligence defined at different points of a given child's age. Therefore, if one child scored low on the test, they could be identified as a struggling student. But although this test was useful, even Binet admitted that this was a test of environmental effects rather than of future performance.
Disappointing.
Next, we have Lewis Terman, who adapted Binet's test for California children and renamed the test to the Stanford Binet test. To Terman, this test was a measure of how much intelligence you were born with, rather than your ability to learn. German psychologist William Stern took the Stanford Binet test, which measured mental age, and turned it into the standardized IQ test by dividing the score of the participant by the average score of someone their age. Thus, a score higher than average will yield a number greater than 100, and a score lower than average will yield a sub-100 score. It should be noted that the IQ system is pretty flawed because it fails to track intelligence well for non-children. It was also used by those favoring eugenics to try to show that some people are inherently smarter than others.
And what about this last guy? I can't pronounce his last name.
It's Wechsler, David Wechsler, who created the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, one of the most widely used tests for intelligence. Unlike the Stanford Binet test, Wechsler's test decomposes intelligence into different attributes, such as vocabulary and spatial reasoning skills. Wechsler's test also exhibits the 3 key traits of good test construction. In order to be accepted, psychological tests must be standardized, reliable, and valid. Standardized means that testing procedures are uniform across everyone taking the test, so scores can be meaningfully compared. Another feature of standardization is that the scores will follow a normal distribution, or a bell-shaped curve. This is because on psychological tests, we expect the population to be close to the mean, or the average. Tests must also be reliable, meaning if the same person takes one several times, their score should be somewhat consistent. Finally, tests should be valid, meaning they assess you correctly. They should show content validity, meaning the test pertains strictly to the topic being tested. It should also show predictive validity, meaning the test is able to predict future performance. Abe, I'm curious, how stable is intelligence over our lifespans?
Well, it depends. Crystallized intelligence reflects the knowledge we've accumulated, such as knowing the meaning of difficult vocab words. Crystallized intelligence increases into old age. Fluid intelligence is our ability to reason quickly and abstractly. It decreases starting in our 20s and 30s.
This is why mathematicians tend to produce their best work in their late 20s and 30s.
If you're scared of your fluid intelligence decreasing, then take comfort that social intelligence increases as we age, just like crystallized intelligence. So older people tend to give better advice if you ask them about social conflicts. Also, our test scores on intelligence tests tend to stay constant after age 11. I forgot one of the most boring bold terms ever. A cohort is a group of people that shares a common characteristic. Now let's move on to the extremes of intelligence, starting at the low end. There are 2 requirements to be diagnosed with intellectual disability, also known as mental retardation. First, the person must have a low intelligence test score. And second, it must be difficult for the person to live independently. One example of a disability is Down syndrome, which occurs in people who have an extra copy of chromosome 21. And having an intellectual disability does have legal ramifications. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that states cannot execute anyone with a mental disability. Let's now shift our attention to the high end of the intelligence spectrum. All that Myers really says in this section is that people who score high on intelligence tests, like they get scores over 135, those people tend to be successful in life. Will, I know that intelligence is at least partly due to genetics, but to what extent and how would we test this?
Can I do that again?
Yeah. Will, I know that intelligence is at least partly due to genetics, but to what extent and how would we test this?
Well, twins and adoption studies give us powerful insight into the extent of intelligence heritability, or to the extent which variation in genes accounts for variation in intelligence. And the experiments show that intelligence is highly correlated with genetics. Twins given tests for the first time will score closer than 2 students who take the same test multiple times per week. MRIs confirm that twins have identical brain structures as well, but scientists have been slow to isolate the specific genes that lead to higher intelligence. We know from current research that variation in genes accounts for around 5% of variation in intelligence. 5% is pretty small, so it makes sense that other studies look for the impact of environmental factors. After children are adopted, their intelligence scores increase, and adopted children also score similarly to their non-genetic brothers and sisters. Both of these show the influence of environmental factors on intelligence. Overall, however, when adopted children's intelligence levels were compared to the levels of their biological parents and adopted parents, the scores were most similar to those of their biological parents, especially as children aged. Given that nature and nurture both influence intelligence, the absence of strong genes or healthy nurture is incredibly detrimental to development. Studies of poorly run orphanages in Iran and Romania confirm that when children grow without interactions with others, they fail to develop mentally. Unfortunately, the opposite case doesn't occur. Basically, there does not appear to be a surefire way to fast forward child development.
Let's talk about gender differences when it comes to intelligence. Men tend to estimate their own intelligence to be higher, compared to females who estimate their own intelligences to be lower. But men and women score about the same on intelligence tests. Women outpace men when it comes to verbal fluency and detecting emotions, but men outpace women in spatial ability tests. These kinds of differences may not be due purely to biology, but they could also be due to social influences. For example, in cultures with more gender equality, like in Sweden, the gender math gap is much smaller than it is in more gender-defined cultures like Turkey. There are also race and ethnicity-based intelligence differences. For example, white Americans tend to outscore black Americans. Now, we're going to make the point that even though racial and ethnic differences in intelligence do exist, these differences might not actually be due to race or ethnicity. Rather, they could be explained by environmental factors. And there are several reasons why we think this. First of all, genetically speaking, all humans are remarkably similar. We're so similar that it's hard to believe our genetics are responsible for intelligence differences. Second, race is a social construction. Strict biological definitions of one race or another do not exist.
The differences in intelligence among racial groups are comparatively small. For example, the intelligence test performance of today's generation exceeds the performance of the 1930s population by a much larger margin than white people's performance exceeds black people's performance.
Fourth, when we compare blacks and whites who have the same pertinent knowledge, their information processing skills are very similar. Fifth, we know that schools and culture strongly affect intelligence. For example, Asian students tend to outperform North American students on math tests, but they also spend 30% more time in school on average. Sixth, and finally, throughout history, we have observed that many different ethnic groups, not just one dominant group, have experienced periods of remarkable achievement. 2,500 years ago, it was the Greeks and the Egyptians. More recently, we often take note of the quote-unquote Asian technological genius. So Will, can you tell me about some of the different types of bias that can appear on tests?
Well, Abe, remember William Stern, the inventor of the IQ test we don't use because it doesn't really work?
Yeah, I remember him.
Well, Abe, he was also a racist.
He was?
Yup, he believed that certain races were more intelligent than others. Because historically, whites have scored better than blacks on intelligence tests have often been used to justify the idea that race or social class influence how smart you are. These differences are caused by bias. And there are two types of bias that have been observed historically in intelligence tests. First, we have classical bias, or a test failing to predict future behavior accurately across all groups. In general, modern intelligence tests do not show this form of bias.
That's good.
But there is a second type of bias, Abe. There is innate bias. Innate bias is produced due to cultural differences between the test writer and the test taker.
For example, I once took an exam where I saw the word regatta, which is basically a fancy word for boating competitions that preppy kids go to.
I don't do regattas.
Preppy kids. But if you grew up in a poor neighborhood, it would be unlikely you'd be familiar with the phrase or even the concept of a regatta.
Other problems have also been observed when trying to produce fair outcomes on tests, notably the stereotype threat, where minorities underperform because they expect to underperform. This is one possible reason black people score higher when other blacks are administering the test, or why girls score higher in all girls' schools. Such phenomena demonstrate that although a test might not be biased in the scientific sense, it can still produce skewed outcomes.
All right, future me, well, thanks for stopping by.
Of course, I want you to know that you do end up doing some great things for yourself.
Oh yeah, well, hey, actually, I had a question. What happened to the 6 girls that I ended up texting? Did they text me back or call me back?
No.
Well, you can't win them all. All right.
I gotta head out.
All right, I'll see you. Bye, future me. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.